Do so me. You are beautiful beyond description, too marvelous for words, too wonderful for comprehension, like nothing ever seen or heard. Who can grasp your infinite wisdom? Who can fathom the depth of your love? You are beautiful beyond description, majesty enthroned above. And I stand in awe of you. I stand in awe of you. Holy God, to whom all praise is due, I stand in awe of you. You are beautiful beyond description, too marvelous for words, too wonderful for comprehension, like nothing ever seen or heard. Who can grasp your infinite wisdom? Who can fathom the depth of your love? You are beautiful beyond description, majesty enthroned above. And I stand in awe of you. I stand in awe of you. Holy God, to whom all praise is due, I stand in awe of you. You're now dismissed to class.
We're still in Daniel. But we are going to move into chapter 3 tonight. Last week we kind of wrapped up chapter 2, but I want to look at the last few verses. Just briefly. Okay, chapter 2, verses 46 through 49. Of course, this is after Daniel has given the interpretation and what the dream was that Nebuchadnezzar had that nobody else could. verse 46 says, Then King Nebuchadnezzar fell on his face, prostrate before Daniel, and commanded that they should present an offering and incense to him. The king answered Daniel and said, Truly your God is the God of gods, the Lord of kings, and a revealer of secrets, since you could reveal this secret. Then the king promoted Daniel and gave him great gifts, and he made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon and chief administrator over all the wise men of Babylon. Also Daniel petitioned the king, and he set Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego over the affairs of the province of Babylon, but Daniel sat in the gate of the king. So I think it's interesting as we read that section. King Nebuchadnezzar, as we've talked about back in chapter 1, after the king interviewed these men after their 3-year training, it says in verse 20 of chapter 1 that he found them, meaning Daniel and his companions, 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers who were in his realm. And yet he comes down to, in verse 47, and it's like he's forgot what he has seen, what he has heard, what he knows about these men. And even, of course, Daniel tells him that his interpretation is not from him, it's from God. And so Nebuchadnezzar says he prostrate before Daniel. He fell down, and basically, in the way I read it, he worshipped Daniel in a form. Then in verse 47, he tells him, says, Truly your God is the God of gods. Now, it's not saying what we might think it means. He's not saying that yours is the one true God, is it? He's saying that of all the gods that we know, yours is the best. Again, like I said, I think it's interesting that that's still how he puts it. And remember, we'll remember that as we go into chapter 3, because it's another important thing to keep in mind as we continue on our study. And I can't think of where this is, where wasn't it Paul that when he was, where he gets to the yes, and says that, of all these gods that you left, to the unknown God. Pardon? Acts 17. I want to look at that. Let's begin in verse 22. It says, Then Paul stood in the midst of the Areopagus and said, Men of Athens, I perceive that in all things you are very religious. For as I was passing through and considered the object of your worship, I even found an altar with the inscription, To the unknown God. Therefore the one whom you worship without knowing, him I proclaim to you. So it's not an uncommon thing, is it, for people to worship what consider the unknown God. And that unknown God is what Paul is saying is that's the one that I'm proclaiming. Here's the same thing. Nebuchadnezzar says he's a God of gods, but that's the one that Daniel is worshiping. That's the one we worship. Says the king promoted Daniel, gave him great gifts, made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon. Why do you think, if Nebuchadnezzar truly was worshiping him, why do you think Daniel did not say, no, this is not, I don't want this? This is a curiosity question on my part. Or was it truly a type of worship that Nebuchadnezzar was doing? Well, that's probably better than what I've got. I don't.
NASB renders that did Thomas.
Okay. but not in the manner of bowing down and yeah. Right. Right. You said that's the New American Standard. Is there another version that says anything? What do you pay homage? That's probably a better translation. Pay homage to to Daniel, because if Daniel was to accept this worship, that if it was truly worship in that manner, um, then it would negate everything that Daniel stood for, what he did in chapter 1, and how he acted in chapter 2 to get the dream and the interpretation. Alan, did you raise your?
Yeah, and I think too the phrase, the things that Daniel said in verse 45, great God has made known to the king what will take place in the future. And then 47, the king says, surely your God is a God of gods. And he said, around that, not that what Nebuchadnezzar did was right, but around that, Daniel sees that he's given honor to God, and the language that Nebuchadnezzar is expressing gives honor to God
Right.
in his own way. It's
Right.
still not
It's,
entirely accurate, nor would homage be accurate, but another thing is Daniel is probably not in a position to, the king's bowing to him. That is a huge step compared to where he was.
right. Yeah. I mean that's a great honor, as from Daniel's standpoint. And one of the things that I read is that he was, I forget how it worded, basically being gracious and accepting what Nebuchadnezzar was doing for him. Um, but I still don't think it was worship the way that we read of our worship should be to God, and the way that they worshipped idols and everything. I think it was, again, paying homage to. Any other comments or questions for? Okay. Um, and again, verse 49, we read Daniel has done this multiple times. He looks out for his friends, and I don't. I think it all has to do with the fact that they're in the same boat as he is. Their faith to God, the way they worship God. Um, so he's wanting to make sure that he does what he can for them. I don't think it's necessarily hey, I got some good buddies, bring them along with me necessarily. There's a reason behind it. Hope. Yes. Yeah. Right. I mean, because they were with Daniel when they refused the king's food. They were with Daniel when they prayed there in verse 18. Uh, so the saying, you've got a friend that's there through thick and thin. These men were those friends, and they were going to stand behind Daniel as long as he remained faithful. There was no wavering of their friendship or their faith. Okay. All right. So chapter 3. Let's read. Let's read the first 7 verses. It says, Nebuchadnezzar the king made an image of gold whose height was 60 cubits and its width 6 cubits. He set it up in the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. And King Nebuchadnezzar sent word to gather together the satraps, the administrators, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces to come to the dedication of the image which King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. So the satraps and the administrators, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces gathered together for the declaration of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up, and they stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Then a herald cried aloud, to you it is commanded, O people, nations, and languages, that at the time you hear the sound of the horn, flute, harp, lyre, and psaltery, In symphony with all kinds of music, you shall fall down and worship the gold image that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast immediately into the midst of a burning, fiery furnace. So at that time, when all the people heard the sound of the horn, flute, harp, and lyre, in symphony with all kinds of music, all the people, nations, and languages fell down and worshipped the gold image which King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Okay. So, I don't think. Hey, Jason, could you go push the button to transfer it up here? Now, it's not known for sure what time frame this is. It's speculated that there's about 14, 16 years between what we consider the end of chapter 2 and the events of chapter 3. But nevertheless, you would think what Nebuchadnezzar knows about what has happened would still ring true in his mind about the faithfulness of Daniel, what Daniel and his companions, who they were, what they stood for. But we find, of course, they don't. So Nebuchadnezzar makes a golden image. Of the things I read, they don't feel like it was a solid gold image. It felt like it was made of some other substance, wood more than likely, and overlaid with gold. And some of the verses that they referenced are Isaiah chapter 40. And we'll look at that just from the verbiage that it says. Chapter 40 and verse 19 says, the workman molds an image, the goldsmith overspreads it with gold, and the silversmith casts silver chains. So here, somebody molds an image and somebody else covers it with gold. Chapter 41, verse 7, so the craftsman encouraged the goldsmith. He who smooths with the hammer inspired him who strikes the anvil, saying, it is ready for the soldering. Then he fastened it with pegs that it might not totter. Jeremiah chapter 10. Chapter 10, verses 3 and 4. For the custom of the peoples are futile, for one cuts a tree from the forest, the work of the hands of the workman with the axe. They decorate it with silver and gold. They fasten it with nails and hammers so that it will not topple. And the last one I want to look at is Exodus chapter 30. Exodus 30, verses 1 and verse 3. This is the altar of incense. It says, you shall make an altar to burn incense on. You shall make it of acacia. I'm going to just say acacia wood. And verse 3, it says, and you shall overlay its top, its sides all around, and its horns with pure gold. And you shall make for it a molding of gold all around. So it was common. I'm not saying that this is exactly how it was, but it was common for something to be made of another, wood, clay, whatever, and then to be covered with gold, silver combination. But either way, this image was 60 cubits tall, 6 cubits wide. We've all talked about how big a cubit is. I've always been told 18 inches is from the elbow to the tip of the finger. So this image was 90 foot tall, roughly, and 9 foot wide. Now, to put that in perspective, a school bus, large school bus, is 40 foot long. And this is a very terrible rendering, but it's as close as I could get. Even with 2 school buses, it's end to end still does not come to the total height of the image. A school bus can be anywhere from 9.5 to foot in height. So I turned the school bus over, and that's roughly how wide the image was. Kind of impressive if you think about it. You've got this very tall, very slender image. Kind of, to me, thinking about it from an engineering standpoint, that's impressive that they didn't make it. I would have thought you'd make it a whole lot wider to keep it from falling over, but they didn't, and it didn't fall over. So again, this is a very large image statue that you're not going to miss. You're going to see it for a good long distance. And the thought process behind why it was gold is Nebuchadnezzar was told he was the head of gold in his dream. And so that's why they thought maybe the thought is why he made the total image of gold. This is their thoughts, but it is considered that it was in the form of a person instead of some type of human-animal combination. But they also feel like it represented a god. More than likely, it was probably Nebuchadnezzar's, what he would consider his favorite god. I didn't read anything that said which god in particular it was. You can look at chapter 3, verse 12, when it says, when they're being, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are being tattled on. It says, O king, they have not paid due regard to you, nor have they served your gods or worshipped the gold image. Verse 14, when Nebuchadnezzar's talking to them, he asked them, did you really not serve my gods or worship the gold image? And then again in verse 18, the three men says, be known that we will not serve your gods or worship the gold image. So it kind of gives you the idea in those scripture that this is a representative of a god. So I don't know what button. There you go. All right, so they placed this in the plain of Dura. There, verse 1. Dura was a very common name in Mesopotamia, but they feel like this Dura was about 6 miles south of Babylon, and the reason that one of the commentators said was there are still ruins of what looks to be a very large square brick structure that says it's around 45 square feet and 20 foot tall. So whether that's the base of this image or not. And I should have mentioned this in the very first couple of classes of where Babylon is. Does anybody know modern day where Babylon is? Iraq. Never didn't think about it until I was trying to see where this plain of Dura might have been, and that's where somebody feels like it was. See Baghdad, we all here know that name, and it's south of Baghdad. And they felt like this plain of Dura was about 6 miles south of Babylon. So, thought that was interesting. Okay, so there we go. So now Nebuchadnezzar has sent for these satraps, administrators, and so on. And y'all that have been around in my class long enough know I like to define some things. Because just to read what a satrap is doesn't do me any good. So a sage trap, I've got the New King James Version. I believe the Old King James says princes. Is that right, Todd? They're in verse 2. Okay. These were chief rulers of a province or a very large region. A administrator or governor would be what we would consider, it'd be comparable to our lieutenant governor. Not the top guy, but his next in line. Governor, which, let me find that, governor or captain, we would consider that the governor. So that word translates the same. Counselor, I believe the New King James says judges. And this would be what we would consider an advisor. Treasurer translates the same. It's just a treasurer. The next one says, in New King James says judges. Old King James says counselors, I believe. And that was a lawyer. And then magistrates or sheriffs, I didn't find anything that really told what that translated to or comparable to today. And it says all the officials or rulers of the province, those were any that had dominion over others. So basically what you had was people of prominence, men who from the very top down to the very bottom, but they had people that served under them. Why do you think, he just called these men? Why doesn't he just make the proclamation to all? Because, that's what he's... Right. Right. No. Right. Yeah. No. I think the majority of these people were probably close, and so it wasn't a hard thing to get them to this image. One of the, and I look at several commentators, one of them did say that it didn't necessarily mean that the peasant or the common man couldn't come, but it wasn't necessarily broadcast to them. I guess if they, if I was supposed to cover that and not be so loud, if they heard about it and came, I don't think he was going to turn them away.
It's kind of like that in his captive. He wanted his captive.
Right. Just to prove, in the end, I think it was just to prove how manly he was, that he did this and to tout his authority. Verse 4 says, a herald cried aloud, meant with great strength. And of course, there was no wireless microphone to get out to everybody that was there in ease. Basically, this was somebody who was a loudmouth, whose voice carries and carries well. We all know those people. They could stand up here without the microphone, and everybody would have no problems hearing them. Stephen Benson's not in here, so I can pick on him. He's one that he probably could, but most of the time when he talks, you got to be fairly close, So nothing wrong with that. I'm not putting him down. That's just, how he is. And like I said, I'm sure he can probably be loud when he needs to. Get him out on the baseball field, and he can probably yell at the kids when needed. But anyway, he had to be loud for as many people to hear. Now I'm sure there was probably somebody on out farther that was, what'd he say? Passing it on a little bit farther. But this guy was in charge of letting everybody know. So basically, verses 5 is, like Roger said, it was an orchestra. There was a combination of horns, stringed instruments, and then I believe it says all kinds of music. So once they started playing, everybody was to immediately fall down and worship this image. Whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast immediately into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. Anybody that has ever built a fire to, whether it's to grill burgers or warm the house or whatever, knows it's not an instant thing once you light it. Fire starts, but you instantly can't throw burgers on the grill. You got to wait a little bit, let it get a little hotter. Remembering back when I was a kid, Dad would build a fire. I mean, to get hot, you would have to be right up against it at first. So it would take some time. One of the things that I've read said that this was probably a constant fire that was continually burning. It wasn't something that they had to get built up in case they needed to, cast somebody into it. Had it been that way, they wouldn't have said they would be cast immediately into the fire. Verse 7, the event happens, the orchestra plays, everybody falls down and worships this idol, except for 3 men. Now, why, and this is another one of those just thought questions because we don't know, where was Daniel? I mean, it doesn't say. We have to assume that he was out, away, far enough away that he was not informed of this. Because had he been there, we would be reading about 4 men that did not bow down to the image. Any thoughts on that? That's the only reasoning that I can find, and the only reason that I can think of is that he's what we would consider he's out of the country. He's nowhere close to this event and knows nothing of it, at least not at the time. We'll read verses 8 through 12, look at that a little bit, and then we'll end here in just a minute. It says, therefore, at that time, certain Chaldeans came forward and accused the Jews. They spoke and said to King Nebuchadnezzar, O king, live forever. You, O king, have made a decree that everyone who hears the sound of the horn, the flute, the harp, lyre, and psaltery in symphony, with all kinds of music, shall fall down and worship the gold image. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast in the midst of the burning fiery furnace. There are certain Jews whom you have set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, have not paid due regard to you. They do not serve your gods or worship the gold image which you have set up. This section right here is where you would think over the however many years from Daniel 1 to the end of Daniel 2, he would remember who Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego was and what they stood for. They were part of as we know, they were the ones that remained faithful to God, who prayed with Daniel, who helped Daniel. Daniel would not have petitioned for them you know, to basically get promoted. Yet, as we'll read later, he doesn't remember that. Why? I'll give you my thought as to why they did this. I feel like that the Chaldeans and all these men who accused, I mean, and it was a true accusation. This wasn't a false one, was it? It was the truth. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego did not bow down to this image. But my opinion is they were jealous of these men. I mean, that's the only conclusion that you can come to. It doesn't say that was the case, not here, but and tattle on what I call it. He comes, you know, kind of like your kids come to you. You know, Kaylee's doing something. Okay, well, is she hurting you? No. Then what difference does it make? Yes, Jr.
Believers usually persecuted by other countries. Most of the time, they're jealous of
Yeah.
they've been God's faithful people.
Right. And that could be some. Yeah. That could be some of it. Yeah. But regardless. All right, we'll start back with verse 8. Either Sunday or next Wednesday. I'll be teaching class Sunday, and we may continue on with verse 8, or I just may wait till next week. But thank y'all for your comments.